The woman's voice cut through the Friday afternoon bustle of Whole Foods like a blade. Sharp, deliberate, cruel. Her manicured fingers gripped an iPhone, while German words spilled from her lips with venomous precision. Diese armen Leute haben keinen Geschmack. Schauen Sie sich nur an, wie aussieht. Ein typischer amerikanischer Unterschichtvater. Garrett Walsh froze mid-step, his weathered hands tightening on the shopping cart where 8-year-old Maisie sat swinging her legs. The woman in the $1,000 Chanel suit continued her brutal assessment without a glance his way. Wahrscheinlich kann sich nicht einmal eine anständige Ausbildung für sein Kind leisten. Probably can't even afford proper education for his child. Then Garrett turned. Slowly, his voice emerged in perfect, fluent German. Entschuldigung, aber Ihre Annahmen sind falsch. Und Ihre Manieren sind beschämend. The woman's mouth fell open. Her iPhone clattered to the tile floor. What this billionaire had just discovered about the paint-stained single father was about to change everything. The cheese aisle of Whole Foods suddenly felt like a courtroom. Every shopper within 20 feet had stopped pretending to read nutrition labels. Victoria Hartwell stood frozen, her credit card halfway out of her designer purse, staring at the man she'd just insulted in what she thought was a language he couldn't understand. Her perfectly styled blonde hair framed a face that had gone pale beneath expensive makeup. Garrett bent down and picked up her iPhone, its screen now spider-webbed with cracks. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Your phone," he said in English, extending it toward her. His voice carried no anger, only a quiet dignity that somehow made the moment more devastating. Maisie watched the exchange with curious blue eyes, the same shade as her late mother's. She didn't understand German, but she understood tension. The little girl had learned to read adult emotions the way other children read picture books. Victoria's hand trembled as she reached for the phone. Their fingers brushed for just a moment, and she noticed his hands weren't just paint-stained. They were strong, calloused from real work, with a thin gold wedding band that caught the fluorescent light. Where did you learn German?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. The confident CEO, who had been barking orders into her phone moments earlier, had vanished, replaced by someone who looked genuinely shaken. "Heidelberg University," Garrett replied, selecting a small block of Swiss cheese from the display. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. 2 years of postdoctoral research in comparative linguistics. He placed the cheese in his cart next to a loaf of whole wheat bread and a gallon of milk. Simple groceries. Honest groceries. The kind that stretched a budget but fed a family. Victoria's eyes tracked every item, her mind racing to reconcile the man before her with her assumptions. The silence stretched until Maisie broke it. "Daddy, what did the lady say about us?" Her voice carried the innocent directness that only children possess. Garrett's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd hoped she hadn't been paying attention, but Maisie had always been observant. Too observant for her own good sometimes. It was a trait she'd inherited from her mother, along with those penetrating blue eyes and an uncanny ability to see through people's pretenses. "She made some incorrect assumptions, sweetheart," Garrett said, his voice gentle but firm. He ran his fingers through Maisie's auburn hair, a gesture so tender it made Victoria's chest tighten unexpectedly. Sometimes people judge others without knowing their story. His eyes met Victoria's again, and she saw something there that made her want to disappear into the polished concrete floor. Not anger, not hurt. Something worse. Understanding. Victoria cleared her throat, her business training finally kicking in. Damage control, reputation management. These were skills she'd honed over years of corporate warfare. "I apologize," she said, her voice steadier now but still lacking its earlier arrogance. My call was stressful, and I spoke without thinking." The words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. How do you apologize for revealing the ugliness of your own assumptions? How do you take back the moment when someone sees exactly who you really are? Garrett nodded slowly, as if accepting an apology he didn't quite believe. We all have difficult days, he said, but there was something in his tone that suggested he'd had more than his share. He started to push his cart toward the checkout lanes, Maisie waving goodbye over her shoulder like the polite child she'd been raised to be. Victoria found herself following them, her feet moving before her brain could protest. "Wait!" she called out, her voice catching slightly. Several shoppers turned to look, their expressions ranging from curious to judgmental. The cheese aisle had become an unexpected theater, and Victoria suddenly realized she was center stage in a performance she hadn't auditioned for. Garrett stopped but didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his expression was patient but wary, like someone who'd learned not to expect good things from strangers. "I'd like to make this right," Victoria said, her words rushing together in an uncharacteristic display of uncertainty. She was Victoria Hartwell, CEO of Hartwell Industries, a woman who commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. Yet here she stood, stumbling over an apology to a man in paint-stained jeans. "Please, let me pay for your groceries. It's the least I can do." Garrett's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his dark eyes. "That's not necessary," he said quietly. Pride. Victoria recognized it because she'd worn it like armor her entire life. But this was different. This wasn't the pride of wealth or status. This was the pride of a man who'd learned to make his own way in the world, who'd discovered that dignity couldn't be bought or sold. Maisie tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, can we get the chocolate cake?" She pointed toward the bakery section, where a display of desserts sat behind glass like edible art. Her request was simple, innocent, but Victoria caught the way Garrett's eyes flicked to the price tag. $24.99. She watched him calculate, watched him weigh his daughter's want against his budget. "Maybe next week, honey," Garrett said, his voice gentle but final. Maisie nodded without complaint, already accustomed to delayed gratification. The interaction lasted only seconds, but it told Victoria everything she needed to know about this man and his daughter. They were a team. They understood each other. They'd learned to find joy in small things because the big things weren't always possible. "The cake, too," Victoria said suddenly, her voice stronger now. "Please, consider it an apology gift for Maisie." She looked down at the little girl, who was studying her with those discerning blue eyes. "I'm sorry I was rude, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups forget their manners." It was perhaps the most honest thing Victoria had said in months. Maisie looked up at her father, silently asking permission. Garrett hesitated, clearly torn between pride and his daughter's happiness. Finally, he nodded. "Say thank you to Ms." He raised an eyebrow, realizing they hadn't been properly introduced. The absurdity of the situation struck him. Here he was, standing in a grocery store with a woman who'd just insulted him in German, about to let her buy his daughter cake. "Hartwell," Victoria said, extending her hand in a gesture that felt oddly formal given the circumstances. Victoria Hartwell. The name seemed to hover in the air between them. Garrett's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not recognition exactly, but something close to it, like a memory trying to surface from somewhere deep and long forgotten. "Thank you, Miss Hartwell," Maisie said with the careful politeness of a child who'd been taught proper manners. "The cake looks really good." Her smile was genuine, uncomplicated by the adult complexities swirling around her. Victoria found herself smiling back, surprised by how the simple gesture warmed something cold inside her chest. They walked toward the checkout together, an unlikely trio navigating the Friday afternoon crowd. Victoria found herself studying Garrett from the corner of her eye. His clothes were worn but clean, his posture straight despite whatever burdens he carried. There was something about him that nagged at her, something familiar she couldn't quite place. The way he moved, the cadence of his speech, the quiet confidence that seemed at odds with his circumstances. At the checkout, Victoria insisted on paying despite Garrett's continued protests. The teenage cashier, Ashley according to her name tag, seemed fascinated by the dynamic between them. She probably saw all kinds of customers during her shifts, but this particular interaction was clearly memorable. Victoria handed over her black American Express card without thinking, the same card she used for business dinners that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. "Have a nice day," Ashley said as she handed over the receipt. Her eyes lingered on Maisie, who was clutching the cake box like precious cargo. Children had that effect on people, Victoria noticed. They made adults remember what pure happiness looked like, what it felt like to be excited about something as simple as chocolate cake. Outside the store, Victoria hesitated beside her midnight blue Bentley. The contrast between her car and Garrett's aging pickup truck was stark, almost comical. Two different worlds that had collided in the cheese aisle and somehow found themselves sharing the same parking lot. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, and Victoria realized she didn't want this encounter to end. Not yet. "Garrett," she said, his name feeling strange on her tongue. "I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't think I'm being presumptuous." She paused, gathering courage she didn't know she needed. "What do you do for work?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them was ready to address. Garrett shifted Maisie's hand in his, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed. "I do repair work, handyman stuff, some part-time work at the elementary school." His answer was matter-of-fact, neither apologetic nor defensive. He was what he was, and he'd made peace with it. But Victoria sensed there was more to the story. There had to be. You don't learn fluent German from fixing leaky faucets. "And before that?" Victoria pressed gently. She was walking on dangerous ground, she knew. Privacy. Privacy was a luxury she'd learned to guard jealously, and she was asking this man to give up his. But something about him compelled her to dig deeper. Maybe it was the way he'd handled her insults with such grace. Maybe it was the obvious love between him and his daughter. Or maybe it was simply the mystery of a brilliant man hiding in plain sight. Garrett was quiet for so long that Victoria began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "I used to teach. University level. Linguistics." 3 simple sentences that contained a lifetime of story. What had happened to bring a university professor to this parking lot, to this moment, to a life of handyman work and careful budgeting? Which university? Victoria found herself asking, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture she wasn't prepared for. A brilliant man, a single father, a daughter with eyes like her late mother's. The wedding ring he still wore despite being alone. The careful way he spoke about his past, as if the words might break if handled too roughly. "UMass Amherst," Garrett said quietly. "Department of Comparative Linguistics." He looked down at Maisie, who was busy examining her cake through the clear plastic container. That was before. Before what, he didn't say. Before his world changed. Before he became the man standing in this parking lot, explaining himself to a stranger who'd judged him without knowing his story. Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves after an earthquake. She'd built her life on quick judgments and decisive action. In the business world, hesitation was weakness, and second-guessing was fatal. But standing here, looking at this man who'd lost one life and built another from the ashes, she felt her certainties crumbling. "I have a proposition," she heard herself saying. The words seemed to come from someone else, someone braver and more impulsive than the Victoria Hartwell who'd walked into Whole Foods an hour ago. "My company needs someone with your language skills. Translation work. German contracts." She was improvising now, but the idea felt right. More than right. It felt like redemption. Garrett's expression remained carefully neutral. "What kind of company?" His question was reasonable, practical. The kind of question a responsible father asks when considering a job offer from a stranger he'd met under less than ideal circumstances. Victoria realized she was about to find out if her reputation preceded her, if the Hartwell name carried weight in circles beyond her usual sphere. "Hartwell Industries," she said, watching his face for recognition. "Medical equipment manufacturing. We do a lot of international business." She paused, then added with what she hoped was professional confidence. "The pay would be significantly better than handyman work." It was a calculated risk, addressing the financial disparity between them directly. But subtlety felt wrong here. This man deserved honesty. Something flickered across Garrett's features. Not excitement exactly, but something like cautious interest. "You're offering me a job?" His tone suggested he found the situation as surreal as she did. "You don't know anything about my qualifications, my work history, whether I'm reliable or competent or—" He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. "I know you're fluent in German," Victoria said firmly. "I know you have a doctorate in linguistics. I know you handled my rudeness with more grace than I deserved." She glanced down at Maisie, who was listening to their conversation with the intense focus children bring to adult discussions they don't quite understand. "And I know you're raising a polite, well-adjusted daughter on your own. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." The silence stretched between them, while Garrett considered. Victoria found herself holding her breath, surprised by how much his answer mattered to her. This wasn't just about assuaging her guilt over the grocery store incident. This was about second chances and unexpected connections and the strange alchemy that could transform a moment of ugliness into something resembling grace. "Daddy," Maisie said quietly, tugging on Garrett's sleeve, "is the nice lady offering you a real job?" Her question was innocent, but it cut straight to the heart of everything. A real job. Not pity, not charity, not a wealthy woman's attempt to buy her way out of an awkward situation. Something real and sustainable and dignified. Garrett looked down at his daughter, then back at Victoria. When he spoke, his voice was steady but cautious. "I'd need to know more details. Responsibilities. Schedule. I have commitments." His eyes flicked to Maisie, making it clear where his priorities lay. This wasn't just about him anymore. Every decision he made had to filter through the lens of fatherhood. Victoria nodded, understanding flooding through her. Of course. Completely reasonable. What if— She paused, pulled out her phone, then thought better of it. Instead, she reached into her purse and withdrew a business card. Real paper, real ink. Something tangible in a digital world. "My direct number. Think about it over the weekend. If you're interested, call me Monday." Garrett took the card, his fingers brushing hers briefly. Victoria was surprised by the calluses on his hands, evidence of the physical work he'd been doing to support his family. "Why?" he asked simply. The question contained multitudes. Why offer him a job? Why risk hiring someone based on a grocery store encounter? Why trust a stranger with her company's business? "Because," Victoria said, surprising herself with the honesty of her answer, "I think we both need this chance to be better than we were an hour ago." It wasn't a business answer. It wasn't strategic or calculated or designed to achieve maximum advantage. It was simply true. Sometimes the most important decisions weren't made in boardrooms, but in parking lots, between people who'd seen each other at their worst and chosen to reach for something better. Maisie had opened the cake container and was carefully examining the chocolate frosting. "Daddy, can we share this when we get home?" she asked, "like we shared the birthday cake last month?" There was something wistful in her voice, a child's understanding that special treats were rare and should be savored. Victoria found herself wondering when Maisie's birthday had been, whether Garrett had managed to make it special despite whatever constraints he faced. "Of course, sweetheart," Garrett said, his voice soft with the kind of love Victoria hadn't heard in years. "We'll have it after dinner." He looked back at Victoria, something approaching warmth in his dark eyes. "Thank you. For the cake. For the—" He gestured vaguely, encompassing the complexity of everything that had happened between them. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly, "for reminding me that assumptions are dangerous things." She watched as Garrett secured Maisie in the truck's passenger seat, noting the careful way he checked her seatbelt twice. Everything about his movements spoke of practiced care, of a routine born from necessity and love. This was a man who'd learned to be both mother and father, to fill all the empty spaces in a child's life. As the pickup truck pulled out of the parking lot, Victoria stood beside her Bentley and realized something had fundamentally shifted. The woman who'd walked into Whole Foods that afternoon, impatient, judgmental, insulated by wealth and status, felt like a stranger. In her place stood someone who'd been forced to confront the ugliness of her own assumptions and found something unexpected on the other side. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Conference call with the Frankfurt team in 30 minutes. Are you still at the grocery store?" Victoria stared at the message, trying to reconcile the world of international business deals and corporate strategies with the conversation she'd just had. The Garrett Walsh who spoke fluent German and held a doctorate in linguistics didn't fit into any category she understood. She got into a car, but didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, she sat in the leather seat that cost more than most people's monthly salary and thought about paint-stained jeans and carefully counted grocery money, and a little girl who was excited about chocolate cake. The contrast should have felt jarring, but instead it felt like a revelation. Like waking up from a dream she hadn't realized she'd been having. The drive back to her office in Springfield took 35 minutes, but Victoria's mind was still in that parking lot. She thought about Garrett's hands, strong and capable despite the calluses. She thought about Maisie's polite thank you, and the way she'd looked at the cake like it was treasure. She thought about university professors who became handymen and the kinds of losses that could reshape a life so completely. Her assistant, Margaret, was waiting with a stack of papers and a concerned expression. "The Frankfurt call is in 5 minutes," she said, glancing at Victoria's uncharacteristically disheveled appearance. "Should I reschedule?" It was a reasonable question. Victoria Hartwell was never late, never unprepared, never anything less than perfectly composed for international business calls. "No," Victoria said, straightening her jacket and walking toward her office. "Let's get this done." But as she settled behind her mahogany desk and opened the conference call software, her fingers found the business card Garrett hadn't given back. She'd handed him one, but somehow he'd left one too. Not literally, but the impression of his story, his dignity, his carefully constructed life built around his daughter's needs. The Frankfurt team appeared on her monitor, their voices crackling through the speakers with talk of quarterly projections and market expansion. Victoria participated, asked the right questions, made the appropriate decisions. But part of her attention remained fixed on the memory of a man who'd chosen grace over anger, who'd turned a moment of cruelty into an opportunity for unexpected connection. When the call ended, Victoria sat alone in her office as the evening shadows lengthened across Springfield. Her company employed 300 people, generated millions in revenue, held patents that advanced medical technology around the world. But somehow none of that felt as significant as the conversation she'd had with a single father in a grocery store parking lot. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for her head of human resources. "Jennifer, it's Victoria. I may have a candidate for the German translation position we discussed. Someone with exceptional qualifications who might be perfect for project-based work." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He's currently between positions but has extensive academic background. I'll send you his information if he's interested." It wasn't charity, Victoria told herself. It was good business. A man with Garrett's educational background and language skills was exactly what Hartwell Industries needed for their expanding European contracts. The fact that he was struggling financially, that he had a daughter to support, that he'd handled her insults with dignity, those were just coincidences. Context. Background information that had no bearing on her business decision. But even as she constructed these rational justifications, Victoria knew she was lying to herself. This wasn't about German translation services or European contracts. This was about the moment when assumptions collided with reality and created something entirely unexpected. This was about second chances and the possibility that people could be better than their worst moments. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Victoria." The voice belonged to her brother James, calling from his law firm in Boston. "I just got off a call with the Schneider people. They're interested in moving forward with the merger discussions, but they want someone who can handle the cultural nuances. The language barriers have been causing problems." Victoria felt something click into place, like puzzle pieces finding their proper configuration. "What if I told you I might have found exactly the right person for that?" she said slowly. "Someone with the academic credentials and cultural understanding to bridge those gaps?" She was thinking out loud now, the possibilities unfolding in her mind like architectural blueprints. "You have my attention," James said. "The Schneider deal could be worth $50 million if we can navigate the communication issues. What kind of background are we talking about?" His voice carried the cautious optimism of someone who'd learned not to count on easy solutions but remained open to unexpected opportunities. "Doctorate in comparative linguistics from a German university," Victoria said, realizing as she spoke that she was committing to something she couldn't take back. "Fluent in German, obviously. Academic experience, currently available for project work." She was describing Garrett Walsh like a resume, reducing their complex encounter to bullet points and qualifications. James was quiet for a moment. "Sounds almost too good to be true. What's the catch?" It was a reasonable question. In their world, exceptional qualifications usually came with exceptional complications. People with doctoral degrees from German universities didn't typically find themselves available for sudden project work without some kind of story behind the availability. "No catch," Victoria said, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. The catch was that she'd met this potential translator by insulting him in a grocery store. The catch was that she had no idea if he'd even accept her job offer. The catch was that she was making business decisions based on parking lot conversations and the way a man treated his daughter. "I'll know more Monday." After she hung up, Victoria sat in her office. As the building emptied around her, through her window she could see the lights of Springfield beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there, Garrett Walsh was probably helping his daughter with homework, or reading bedtime stories, or doing whatever single fathers did in the quiet hours of the evening. She thought about the cake they were sharing, the simple pleasure of chocolate frosting, and a child's laughter. When was the last time she'd experienced something that uncomplicated? When had she last felt joy that wasn't connected to profit margins or market share or beating the competition? The questions felt dangerous, like examination of a life she'd been too busy living to actually consider. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from her personal assistant. Reminder, dinner with the Patterson Group at 8. Car is waiting downstairs. Another business dinner, another evening of strategic conversations and careful networking, another night of playing the role of Victoria Hartwell, successful CEO, while some other version of herself, the one who'd stood in a parking lot and offered a job to a stranger, remained locked away. She gathered her things and headed for the elevator, but something made her pause at Margaret's desk. Her assistant had left a neat stack of papers for Monday morning, along with a coffee mug that read, "World's Most Patient Assistant." The normalcy of it struck Victoria suddenly. Margaret had worked for her for 5 years, handled her schedule, fielded her calls, managed her professional life with quiet efficiency. But what did Victoria actually know about her? Did Margaret have children? Hobbies? Dreams that extended beyond organizing someone else's calendar? The elevator descended toward the parking garage where her driver waited with the Bentley. Victoria caught her reflection in the polished steel doors and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Same perfectly styled hair, same expensive suit, same confident expression. But something fundamental had shifted behind her eyes. Some certainty had cracked, leaving room for questions she'd never thought to ask. The dinner with the Patterson Group passed in a blur of familiar conversations about market opportunities and strategic partnerships. Victoria played her part perfectly, asking the right questions, making the appropriate commitments, navigating the complex dance of high-level business negotiations. But her mind kept drifting to a little girl sharing chocolate cake with her father, to paint-stained jeans and careful grocery budgets, and the quiet dignity of starting over. It wasn't until she was back in her penthouse apartment, looking out over the city lights, that Victoria allowed herself to fully process what had happened. In the space of a few hours, her understanding of the world had been fundamentally challenged. Not by a business rival or market forces or any of the usual disruptions that shaped her professional life. By a single father in a grocery store who'd reminded her that assumptions were dangerous things. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat in her living room, surrounded by art that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The irony wasn't lost on her. She lived in luxury that would be incomprehensible to someone like Garrett Walsh, yet she felt envious of something he possessed that no amount of money could buy. The simple joy of sharing cake with his daughter. The knowledge that he was loved unconditionally. The purpose that came from being someone's whole world. Victoria's phone sat silent on the coffee table, but she found herself staring at it as if willing it to ring. What if Garrett didn't call on Monday? What if their encounter had been just that? A momentary collision of different worlds that would leave no lasting impact. The possibility bothered her more than it should have. She'd built her life on controlling outcomes, on making things happen through force of will and strategic planning. The idea that something she wanted might be entirely beyond her influence felt foreign and uncomfortable. Sunday passed slowly, filled with the usual activities that comprised Victoria's weekends. A workout with her personal trainer. Brunch with colleagues who discussed business even during their supposed leisure time. An art gallery opening where she smiled and made small talk and wrote checks for causes she supported more from obligation than passion. Through it all, she found herself thinking about Maisie Walsh and whether the little girl had finished her homework, whether she was excited about going back to school on Monday, whether she understood how lucky she was to have a father who put her needs above everything else. Monday morning arrived with its usual rush of emails and conference calls and decisions that needed to be made. Victoria threw herself into the familiar rhythm of corporate leadership, but she caught herself checking her phone more frequently than usual. By 10 o'clock, she'd convinced herself that Garrett wouldn't call. By noon, she was certain their encounter had meant more to her than it had to him. By 2 o'clock, She was prepared to file the entire experience under learning moments and move on. Then her phone rang. "Miss Hartwell?" The voice was familiar, careful, uncertain. "This is Garrett Walsh. We met on Friday at Whole Foods." As if she could have forgotten. As if their conversation hadn't been playing on repeat in her mind for 3 days. Victoria felt her heart rate accelerate in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine or stress, and everything to do with possibilities she hadn't dared to hope for. "Garrett," she said, trying to keep her voice professionally neutral. "I'm glad you called." The understatement of the century. She was glad in ways she couldn't begin to articulate, relieved that their story would have at least one more chapter. "Have you had time to consider my offer?" There was a pause that stretched just long enough to make Victoria nervous. When Garrett spoke again, his voice carried the careful weight of someone making a decision that would change everything. "I'd like to hear more details," he said finally. "About the position, the responsibilities, the schedule." Practical questions from a practical man who'd learned to be cautious about opportunities that seemed too good to be true. Victoria smiled, feeling something like joy bubble up in her chest. "Excellent," she said, reaching for her calendar. "When would be convenient for you to come in for a proper interview?" The word felt inadequate. What they needed wasn't an interview so much as a conversation about second chances and unexpected connections, and the possibility that two people from entirely different worlds might have something valuable to offer each other. "I can do tomorrow afternoon," Garrett said, "after I drop Maisie off at school." Always the father first. Always thinking about his daughter's needs before his own. Victoria found herself respecting him more with each interaction, understanding why a little girl could grow up feeling safe and loved despite whatever hardships they faced together. "Perfect," Victoria said, making a note in her calendar. 2 o'clock? She paused, then added, "Garrett, thank you for calling. I know this isn't exactly conventional, and I appreciate you taking a chance on—" She struggled for the right words. On what? On her? On them? On the possibility that Friday afternoon's collision of worlds might lead somewhere neither of them had expected. "Thank you for offering the chance," Garrett said quietly. "Maisie hasn't stopped talking about the cake, or the nice lady who bought it for her." There was something in his voice, a warmth that suggested their encounter had left an impression on him too. That maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just about job opportunities and professional advancement. Maybe it was about something more human and more necessary. After they hung up, Victoria sat in her office chair and realized she was smiling. Really smiling, not the professional expression she wore for business meetings and networking events. This was the kind of smile that came from genuine anticipation, from the feeling that something good was about to begin. She hadn't felt this way about a Monday afternoon in longer than she could remember. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions she hadn't known she was asking. Tomorrow would determine whether a moment of ugliness in a grocery store could transform into something beautiful and sustainable. Tomorrow would show whether Victoria Hartwell, CEO and billionaire, could become someone worthy of Garrett Walsh's trust and Maisie's cake-bright smile. But today, for the first time in years, Victoria found herself looking forward to tomorrow with something that felt remarkably like hope.